to talk a bit about the community of Norvelt in Westmoreland County. Norvelt's name was given to this community a few years after the community had been part of a program of rural homesteading that was one of the pilot projects that was part of the Roosevelt New Deal. And the name was drawn from both the first and last name of Eleanor Roosevelt. And the name is appropriate because Mrs. Roosevelt played a very significant role in these attempts to deal with the issues of rural poverty in the coal mining regions of Appalachia during the New Deal. Probably to best understand the situation, we need to realize that although these communities, these homesteading communities, were established in rural areas, they were not areas that were primarily peopled by folks who were involved in farming. That Appalachia's great economic asset throughout the latter part of the 19th century and well into the 20th century was the fact that there was a great seam of coal, probably one of the richest soft coal seams in the world, that ran through much of Pennsylvania, West Virginia, and Kentucky. This was known as the Pittsburgh seam, and with the burgeoning industries of the 19th century, there was a massive increase of demand for the production of coal and its byproduct, which was coke, which was a very important component in the production of iron and steel. Following World War I, there was a very noticeable decrease in the industrial sector of America that was producing iron and steel, and that had its impact on these rural areas where miners lived, and where they lived often in a rural setting in company-owned towns, what are often referred to as a mining patch. And these patches were built close by the entrance to these mines where the soft coal was extracted. With the decrease in production of steel and then the decrease in the demand for coal, and the fact that in order to make a living, both in terms of the coal companies and in terms of the coal miners, as the price of coal went down, more and more coal was produced. That had an adverse effect because it was a greater amount of supply and the price dropped. And so probably by the 1920s, coal miners in Pennsylvania and West Virginia and in Kentucky and these areas of Appalachia, where the entire economy rested on the production of coal, were slipping further and further behind in terms of their quality of life. And in fact, in many ways, using the standards of the late 20th century, the early 21st century, we would say that most of these families were living far below the poverty level. With the coming of the Great Depression, which started in 1929, conditions grew even worse because it was a significant decrease in production, and that resulted in a significant situation that affected these miners, because many of the miners had very little work or no work at all. And they were living in conditions that were in homes that were, for the most part, frame homes, no insulation, poorly heated, usually only heated by the cast iron stove that was in the kitchen, no running water, no income. Whatever income they might have had was primarily given back to the company that owned the property that they lived in, and also owned the company store nearby that they depended on for the meager amounts of food and other supplies that they needed to simply stay alive. During the Hoover administration, before the coming of the New Deal, Herbert Hoover was very conscious of this and began to try to find ways to maybe address this issue of the the plight of these mining communities throughout Appalachia. But his attempt was not able to really muster the kind of economic commitment that could help to improve the lives of these folks. With the coming of the New Deal, there was a very decided attempt to experiment in a wide variety of ways to try to address many of these social problems. And there were a great number of social problems that the New Deal addressed, and in many instances they were experiments to see if this particular approach to solving a problem would work. If it worked, it was continued. If it didn't work, it didn't achieve the goals, oftentimes it simply was put aside. The urban homesteading, or rather the rural homesteading, it really be called a rural homesteading program, developed early in the 1930s. And it set the stage for what became at Norvelt a community of subsistence farming. And it was significantly influenced by a man by the name of Clarence Pickett, who had been a member of the American Friends Service Committee, which is a Quaker organization. And it was an organization that both Presidents Hoover and President Roosevelt relied upon for the work that they had done to address many of the issues of poverty and the growing amount of poverty both in urban areas and in rural areas as well. And so they were trying to address in the issue of Norvelt what happened when you had significant numbers of mining patch towns where there was absolutely no work, and there was this expansiveness of poverty in large sections of what were rural counties of Pennsylvania and West Virginia. The first attempt at this kind of what was referred to as subsistence homesteading was done in West Virginia, not far from Morgantown in West Virginia, near Grafton, West Virginia, which was a pilot project that was known as Arthurdale. A similar program developed here in Pennsylvania, about 30 miles from Pittsburgh, in a rural section of Westmoreland County, maybe 7 or 8 miles south of the county seat of Greensburg, which was an area where there were a number of mining patches, these small little villages that dotted the landscape that looked as if it was primarily rural, but in fact most of the inhabitants, most of the residents of these areas were unemployed and extremely poor miners and their families. And so in 1934, really under the leadership of several of the New Deal programs, a large tract of land, about 1,500 acres, was purchased in this area, and plans were laid out to create what was referred to as a subsistence homesteading program.